very important in your own work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I trained as a sociologist at London School of Economics, and so what I'd initially got interested in were a set of questions to do with belief systems as addressed by political scientists. And it was through that that I began to get interested in a set of issues. This is early 1970s, which in Britain was specifically focused on the news media, because that period from 72 through to 74, 75, 76 in Britain was an enormous period of industrial unrest. You had big strikes with the miners and so on. And there was an awful lot of interest in how those industrial conflicts were being reported in the news media, what kind of shape the story of those conflicts was being given. And I became interested in that question when I was setting off to do my thesis, which was a thesis on the ideology of television news and what you could say about the way in which societal conflict was reported in the news media. And I suppose one of the key inputs for me was the fact that at that time I'd also been very involved in a kind of community politics in East London around a project called Centerprise, which was a kind of community cafe which had a literacy project and which had there was a thing of the attempt to produce a people's autobiography of Hackney, of the area in which we were living. It involved people like who had been through the Harold Rosen's language and class workshops. It was a set of issues to do with class, language, culture, memory, forms of representation, which I was involved in that sense. Now I suppose I was trying to relate what I was doing academically and theoretically to that. Anyway, so at that point, that's when, in fact, when I first heard of the Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies. A friend of mine who was also involved in the Centerprise project, Ken Warpole, had been asked up to do a talk on what we were doing at Centerprise. But I didn't think much of it at the time. And I registered for my PhD at the University of Kent, and I was allocated Frank Parkin, the political sociologist, as my supervisor. And I went there the one time and only really ever had one effective supervision with him, and he was very polite. He's a very sharp guy. And at the end of it, he just said, well, okay, that's very interesting, Mr. Morley, but I've got two things to say. First of all, I don't know anything about the media, but I believe there's a man called Stuart Hall in Birmingham who does, so why don't you give him a ring? So I did. I got involved in the Centre's media group. But second, he said, all very well you doing this stuff on the ideology of television news, but unless you could in some sense demonstrate that it has an effectivity in relation to the audience who consume it, so what? Why bother? And I was really browned off at the time. I thought, well, this is dumb. I'm doing things on television news, and here I am, whatever it is, nearly 20 years later, still trying to answer the question that Frank Parkin said.
What about your did you stay at Birmingham for some time, or were you?
Well, you'd have to understand, I actually grew up in Birmingham. I can still do a Birmingham accent up to a point. And I spent a lot of my teenage years trying to get out of Birmingham. So the last thing I was going to do was go back and live in Birmingham again. I was a member of the media group at the Cultural Studies Centre from 72 to 76. And then I was employed on a part-time basis as a research fellow there from 76 to 79. But I never actually lived there or was there full-time. I always kind of commuted up and down from London, because all that time I was still very involved in a set of community politics projects in East London. I didn't want to move out of Hackney, so I was forever on the train between London and Birmingham. But I was there, in that sense, throughout the 70s almost.